Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Twilight Talk for this month. I'm Charlotte from the Green Register, and I've got my colleague Elaine with me. So if you've got any issues during the session, then please just reach out to us and we'll try and help. We're very delighted to welcome Anna Pagani. She is an architect and research fellow at the UCL Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering. And this is the question we'll be addressing this evening. Is stopping building new homes the solution to the twin climate and housing emergencies? It's quite a big question. And the nice thing about this session is that we'll be inviting your interaction. So during the session, Anna will be talking a bit, but she'll also be using Mentimeter to get your feedback on this question and other questions related to it as well. So that should be really great for our interaction and get everyone involved. We'll also be inviting your questions through the chat like we normally do. So if you've got questions or comments that you'd like to put into the chat while Anna's talking, then we'll pick those up towards the end of the session. It won't be really a standard Q&A session, so we'll invite you to put your digital hand up and speak if you'd like to, or we can read out your question in the chat if you prefer. But either way, it's time for a bit of a discussion towards the end of the session. As usual, if you wouldn't mind just keeping your mics off until that time, that'd be great. We are recording the session, so you'll be able to view the recording after we've finished. Should be available next couple of days, and we'll let you know. And we'll also be able to pass on the slides from Anna as well. So delighted to have Anna with us. I'll let her pick it up from here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm gonna share my screen. So here we are, share, and I'm gonna put it full screen. Does it work? Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm gonna put this a little bit smaller up here. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation today. So I'm Anna. As mentioned, I work at the Bartlett School of Energy, Environment and Resources at UCL, and I'm moving to King's College London as a senior lecturer very soon in December. My background is in architecture, but my research and teaching is specifically on systems thinking, housing sustainability, and health. And so the session that we're going to have today is going to be split into two parts. So in the first part, I'm mainly going to give a presentation, but it's going to be still quite interactive. So we're going to try to use Mentimeter. Let's see if it works out, if technology is on our side. And the second part, instead, the second half an hour is going to be more interactive. And I hope we're actually going to really manage to discuss with each other about this topic, for which we do not have perfect answers, but actually it's more provocative thoughts, and we're going to see how it goes. So in this first part, I'm going to present the results of a study that was conducted within the broader framework of a research project on housing justice that I've been leading at UCL. And in this study, we're really addressing the question of whether stopping building new homes could be a solution to the twin climate and housing emergencies. This may sound absolutely absurd, considering the current situation in the UK and in England. It is sufficient to open Google or any browser, look for the housing crisis in England to see so many posts about difficult challenges that housing is facing and residents are facing today. We've got 8.5 million people with symptoms of unmet housing needs in England in 2021. 17% of English households lived in non-decent homes just a few years ago, and a third of them come from racialized and minoritized communities. Temporary accommodation was a contributory factor in the death of 55 children in only 4 years. And we've got an increase of nearly a third in rough sleeping in 2023. And nearly half of the cases were in London and in the southeast. So we do have a housing crisis. The response of this government has been to build a very large number of homes. We've all heard of this target of 1.5 million homes. And just a few days ago, there was this post LinkedIn saying that the housing and regeneration sector will need to build at a rate not seen in generation. I mean, these targets have been oscillating over time. We've heard already actually of 3 million homes. We've heard of hundreds of thousands of homes a year. But let's look a little bit more into detail about other indicators related to housing construction. A study actually by Moonheim in 2019 shows that it's been since 1996 that the number of dwellings in England has been overtaken the number of households. So the housing stock in England has grown 14% faster than the number of households, which is already something that raises few questions, right? It seems like we have more housing than the number of households. And if you think of the geography of it, actually we see that in particular the region of London and the southeast, so those that really are suffering from severe shortage, they have really the new construction has really outbuilt household formation in the past 20 years. So we really have many more homes than households. And often we say, well, we need more and more housing so that prices could go down because we do have a housing affordability crisis. And what's interesting is that despite this continuous house building, when we look at this graph, the ratio between house prices to earning continues increasing. So houses are more and more expensive, both in London and in England in general. And if we look specifically at a crucial vehicle for good quality, affordable accommodation, and really what could be defined a critical prerequisite for health equity, which is social housing, we can see that between the end of the 70s and today, social housing has gone from 31% to only 16%. So in this picture, we continue building, housing prices are continuing going up, and social housing is decreasing. And on the top of this, researchers have been showing that this continued housing expansion as a mechanism for meeting housing targets actually goes in conflict with England's ecological targets. But it seems like we're locked into this pathway of housing expansion regardless. So it's as if we had this problem, the housing crisis, and we're trying to fix it through new construction. And we have this illusion of solving the housing crisis through building more. But actually what we're doing is that we're creating more problems. So there is a discrepancy between what we would call the goal of the system, which is more affordable housing for everyone, its growth-dependent structure on construction, and its outcome, so what we call the system behavior. So a reduction in social housing, homelessness, death, etc. And that's where systems thinking become very precious. So in systems thinking, we use the iceberg model. So we see what's out of the water, events, for instance, overcrowding, rough sleeping, non-decent homes. And underwater, there are patterns and trends that have been there over time, like residualization, racial discrimination, disinvestment, gentrification. And those patterns are produced by system structures, the way in which the provision of housing is financed, the way in which we design our system of housing delivery. And those structures are produced by our mental models, the way in which we think that the world works. For instance, what is the role of the government or what is the role of the market in providing social housing? Are sustainable communities mixed tenure communities or not? And using systems thinking can help us shed light on those system structures and on the mental models that produce them and that underpin the provision of social housing. And this potentially can help us think of systemic intervention that are aligned with the goal to provide social housing for all within planetary boundaries. So if we look indeed at those system structures, where are the key issues? So we know that currently we have a decreasing quality of the housing stock. In parallel, we need to meet those ambitious house building targets. We have changing regulatory requirements like the decent home standards, net zero targets, etc. And on the top of that, social housing doesn't receive any funding. So we have a cross-subsidy model. What does this mean exactly? Well, it means that when we do a regeneration projects, we need to demolish. We tend to demolish social homes so that we can densify existing estates, provide market homes that are gonna, on the one hand, solve the social housing crisis, finance new sustainable social housing, and create mixed communities. This is the narrative that we have heard for actually decades today. The reality of that is that, of course, in this example, for instance, every flat in New South London development has been sold to foreign investors. So those market homes for the social housing crisis haven't exactly been delivered. And at the same time, the provision of social housing, as we have seen, is often compromised due to negotiations between developers and local authorities, for instance. So let's look at the structure behind this. If we look at, this is called the causal loop diagram, so a system structure. In this causal loop diagram that we developed together with housing associations, we can see how often we tend to focus on social housing construction and market housing construction. One helps the other through a surplus that is reinvested in, for instance, the maintenance and repair of the existing stock or building more housing. And we think, well, this system could work as it is. However, it is part of a much broader and much more complex system for which when we build and when we use those fundings to build, we're actually moving away from maintenance and repair, which has an impact on the quality of the social housing stock, which puts more pressure on, for instance, housing associations and on their funding in order to sustain their residents, which eventually impact the staff that is taking care of the existing stock, creating more shortage and more turnover, eventually affecting again the quality of the housing stock. So a much more complex picture than what we would linearly think of being able to solve just by building more. Same thing with demolition. A poor quality of the housing stock would bring us to demolish more. And at the same time, the need to make more efficiencies in terms of to respond to the financial pressure to build more market homes. However, also this is part of a much more complex system for which demolition means displacement, dispossession of residents. It means reinforcing stigma, the same stigma that leads to demolition. It means more support needed for tenants and more financial pressure, eventually leading to bigger disconnection between housing association and residents, and again, more stigma and demolition. So in response to actually these systemic issues that compound each other, housing and environmental justice activists have united in campaigns to refurbish, don't demolish, or to fill empty homes. There is really a call for radical reforms of collectively designed alternative to what we see as this kind of growth-dependent system. And a little bit across the globe, we've started talking about the idea of a global moratorium on new construction. What would happen if we were just to stop building? A question that also Architect Climate Action Network has been discussing last year. And we've used this systems map and we've used this knowledge gathered through systems thinking to think, both using those causal loop diagram that you've just seen and discussing together with the housing associations that were partnering in our project. What if to provide more and better quality social housing, there were a moratorium on new house building across the sector? So what if we were to stop building entirely? What could happen? So I'm going to ask you already to go on menti.com and to use this code that you see here, 89426263, to just write a few ideas of what you think would happen if we were to stop building entirely. And let me know if you have any technical issue, you can write it in the chat and we can keep an eye on it.
I've just put the link and the code in the chat for if that makes it easier for everyone.
Thanks a lot. I already see some answers popping up. We will have to retrofit a lot more buildings, absolutely. An existing housing building more. Refurb, retrofit. Using all the empty construction available to provide dwelling, higher housing prices, increased prices, less opportunity for speculation, more retrofit, carbon emissions through production of virgin material would drop. Will there be enough housing to cope with the demand? Very good question. We're going to address this. Housing developers will be out of job. Will they change focus line of work? An excellent question. We're also going to be looking at that. Crisis among building merchants. We're gonna try to address this together. We rethink how home ownership works. We're also going to discuss this. Demand for existing houses will increase, including less desirable and empty dwelling. Yes. Massive media lobbying and complaints by the house building and property industry. Yeah, most probably. Focus on improving existing social housing, changing council tax income, quality of existing housing would improve, increase in retrofit. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for all these inputs. Different building types will get converted. Yeah, we're going to also talk about conversion. Less road building, interesting. Yes, moving from housings to actually trying to look at the neighborhood scale. Need for much more skilled labor force. Yes, retraining our skilled labor force. Education of construction professional changes. Less disruption for biodiversity. Rainwater management. Combined systems are a problem. Good. I hope we're going to be able to discuss this also in the second half. I'm curious to hear more about this. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for inputting. Okay, a little bit more, and then more placemaking and value on current development socially. It's also a point that was raised. Reduced urban sprawl, increase in communal living, family structure, like multi-generational and intergenerational housing, another point that I'm going to present soon. Older homes don't meet modern space standards, more difficult to deliver better quality in terms of energy efficiency. Yes, it's very good. We hopefully will also be able to discuss about this. Compatible with 15-minute cities, flats that were originally built for students, reconversion, increase in maintenance, if less building on floodplains, reduced flooding risk. So thank you. Focus on quantity instead of quality. I'm going to stop the poll. Thanks so much for all of these inputs. I'm going to see whether we're going to be able to cover all of these, and if not, we're gonna address them in the second half. So when asking this question to housing association, what did they reply? Immediately, the financial model, the worry about the fact that land and building value could increase. It was also one of the points that you mentioned. How will we do with the high cost of maintenance and repair? How will we be able to subsidize this? We need to adapt our stock to climate change. How will we be able to fund this? We are heavily reliant on cross-subsidies. We're going to disrupt this model. How is it going to work? And then even if we were able to calculate the fact that there are benefits across the system, including on residents' health, how will we do to overcome our siloed work? Because for now, the benefits on residents' health do not feed back into our housing system, for instance. The number of social homes, the concerns about the fact that we have a housing shortage, that the risks to be more overcrowding, that housing associations feel a historical responsibility to build and actually to meet housing targets, despite them defining them often as arbitrarily set. Housing quality, sometimes the perception, it was also one of the comments I saw, that new build can provide the right type of social housing compared to old build. However, there were also reflections on the fact that quality of new build is often not guaranteed, and that perhaps housing association will be able to focus much more finally on maintenance and repair only, which would have beneficial impact across the system. And here it's when we started engaging more with the causal loop diagram, saying that actually we could also use the housing stock more efficiently. We could redistribute space. We could abolish the right to buy. We could, however, we will need to pay attention also to the negative effects of previous experience, like the permitted development rights. So these were some of the thoughts and comments that emerged from the discussion together with housing associations. So we used our causal loop diagrams that you saw before, and we used the obstacles and opportunities the housing associations have mentioned, plus existing data, to draw some hypotheses or some conclusions that 7 of them that I'm going to present you today. The first is that a moratorium could challenge the narrative of the housing crisis. We don't question whether there is a housing crisis, but how it is conceptualized. I've just shown you that supply has outpaced demand across England since 1996. And for those who wrote that housing prices would increase, as I've shown you before, the construction has had a very marginal effect on housing prices. And here are 2 reports, one from 2019, showing that actually plans to boost housing supply significantly above their current rates will not solve problems of high housing prices or low home ownership. And another recent report published just last month from the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, showing that actually freeing up existing housing stock would have a much more immediate impact than relying solely on new construction, because we need to really address the issues of speculative demand and prioritizing housing as a social good. So here we would move from building to afford. So we continue building so that we can afford housing, towards maintaining to be able to inhabit. So these are 2 very different mental models. The second is a moratorium would require engaging with sufficiency and finity. And here I ask you another question on the Mentimeter. Using, if I'm correct, this should be the same quote. And it's, do you think that we have sufficient housing already in England for the population? So you see it's slowly building in a half-half yes to a maybe no. We're in that, the yes are slowly building up. Yeah, quite a split between the yes and maybe, and then few that instead are more on the no side. So let's look at, I'm gonna just close the voting. Thanks for sharing. So we have 1.5 million unoccupied dwellings in England. This includes vacant and second homes. This is a recent study, and I'm happy to share the report with you by colleagues. And actually also the specific definition of what they mean when they say empty homes, doing long-term empty homes, extended empty homes, etc. You can find everything on the website, and I can share the original data so that you can explore it. And on the top of these 1.5 million empty homes, which surprising enough coincides with the 1.5 targets of the government, when we look at the distribution of the homes that instead are occupied, so not those 1.5 million homes, we can see that in another recent study by Goff and colleagues, the homes that we occupied and the bedrooms that we occupied, 50% of those are used to meet our household needs. We have a spare bedroom, which we can understand, I mean, like for home office reasons, etc. But we have also 17% of households that have 2+ spare bedrooms. And these tend to be those, for instance, whose kids have left and who tend to live in too large housing, for instance. So we both have a large number of unoccupied dwellings, and we also have a large number of under-occupied dwellings, which means that we have very poorly distributed housing. So we continue building homes because some of those are actually largely under-occupied. So a study by Drunok and colleagues shows that actually, similar to what the previous study was saying, the current rate of construction exceeds population growth and projections of population growth. So the living floor area per capita is increasing. And interesting enough, if we look at projections for the future, we can see that if we were to stop building entirely by 2035, we wouldn't even reduce today's living floor area per capita. Actually, we could increase it to EU average within the carbon budget that we have and within zero emission by 2050. And in contrast, if we were continuing to build housing to the government targets set before the current government, we would double the cumulative emissions than the budget allows. Third, a moratorium could prompt the implementation of innovative solutions in design, planning, and management. What do I mean by that? We could think, for instance, of an exemption from a share of capital gain tax when people sell for social rent, for instance. We could think of a community right to buy of those second homes or empty homes. We could think of a new government-funded empty homes program to refurbish empty properties, or a register of property ownership and usage, especially for Airbnbs. We could think about abolishing the right to buy, which has already happened in Scotland and elsewhere. But we could also think of multi-generational and intergenerational housing. All of those examples here, you have a picture on the right of Meralswohnen in Switzerland, where I did my PhD and my postdoc. That is one example of cooperative housing, of multi-generational and intergenerational housing. And in this case, for instance, housing association clearly said that perhaps they could move from being sorts of private developers to actually the best housing managers. And so here I open again the question for you. What could you think in terms of innovative solutions in the construction sector that could be implemented if we were to stop building entirely? Self-finished refurbs. Conversion of empty buildings to dwellings, effective refurbishment rather than build new, convert offices to residential. Splitting existing larger home into generational homes flats, removing VAT from conversion work, absolutely. Multi-generational reduction in VAT, yes. Need to take that up. Yes, we all agree with this. I see there is a large agreement that the 20% VAT on retrofit is absolutely nonsense. Yes. I'll just leave it open for one more minute. If there is any additional idea. Areas as development above existing properties. Aha, interesting. Yes. More demolition of large social housing, massive gardens. This I agree a little bit less. Often offer incentives with council tax to live in right side property, innovation with listed buildings. Yeah, a big challenge indeed. There is need for innovation also on that front. Compulsory purchase of streets to reconfigure them. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing all these ideas, and that I hope that we will bring back in the second half to discuss them. So a guide handbook on how to best renovate a house. Interesting, yes. Property taxes that discourage wasteful extension but promote smaller but well-sized dwelling units. Building standards of maintenance of existing structures and building. Greater VAT on new builds, yes. And make remote working more accessible so that you can work for a London company, for example. And this is also one point that was mentioned by housing associations, indeed. Thanks for sharing all of these ideas. And some of those ideas were, as I've mentioned also, for instance, during the workshop, and in particular on this fourth point, that a moratorium could challenge the idea that building new means building better and for everyone. And in particular, our causal loop diagram suggests that shifting focus and funding from redevelopment to maintenance and repair could have beneficial impacts across the system. However, the participants in the workshop often mentioned the concerns around the end of life of building, about dysfunctional architecture models that are difficult to handle, about the many advantages of new build, like better quality, easier to maintain, more energy efficiency, etc. So, however, many studies have shown that the retention and upgrading of housing has been shown to be socially, environmentally, and economically better than demolition. But of course, we need to pay attention to the adequacy of the existing housing stock. And for this, I invite you to think about the geographical location of ghost enclaves, so places where you have more than 20% of empty homes, as the study before of Atkinson has shown. These ghost enclaves are, for instance, in the city of London that has more than 27% of empty homes, or cities like Cambridge that have more than 20% of empty homes. So actually, it's really under our eyes. And within this setting, we could think about a new role for the architect and builder as that of unbuilding, reparative works, and resources stewardship. One last question, I promise, is when you look at actually these different ideas that building new might mean building better, but what are successful case studies in which instead not building new has meant to build better? I will just collect 2 or 3 ideas. Aha, an old slaughterhouse converted into a single-person dwelling. Thank you for sharing. Then maybe if you find, you can always add these links into the chat if others are interested in looking at these examples. So if you have examples, don't hesitate to share. It's always enriching to learn from others. Conversion of offices. Are you able to see the results appearing? Yes, okay. My dad's and my back to brick renovation on grade 2 and 900 properties. Fantastic. Park Hill in Sheffield, conversion of offices. Just 1 more minute. Conversion of school, chapels, and barns. And for instance, when we talk about conversion of offices, this is one of the points where the adequacy will, of course, need to be taken into account, which helps me actually to move to my next points. So thanks for sharing these initial examples. And if you have others, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. So finally, last 2 points, like a moratorium would require a redesign of the current business model of housing provision. And here we could think about permanent social cooperative, community land trust that would help retain rather than capture the social and use value of land. And implementing these models, however, would also require alternative measures of value creation. What do we mean by value creation? And we need to be able actually to account for the cross-sectoral benefits of retaining existing housing that prioritize health and well-being for all within planetary boundaries, what we call degrowth. A moratorium would also engage stakeholders in thinking and designing systemically. This means thinking and understanding the current system better, beyond, and really understand what the housing crisis actually means. Understand where we collectively want to go towards, and understanding the different means to achieve that, especially rethinking about the conditions that will be needed for when we will start building again.
And finally, a moratorium will need to be part of a broader project of transformation. Because, of course, we need to imagine that if we were to only have permitted development rights in a system that is only oriented towards profit, then we will have the detrimental consequences that we're seeing today that has had very detrimental effects on the health and well-being of residents. Same thing for the bedroom tax that has actually affected social housing tenants with extremely negative consequences. So we need to think about this moratorium as part of a transformation that is broader in society, that is going to support this moratorium, and at the same time, this moratorium would support this change in society through justice, sufficiency, satisfaction, deurbanization, different ways of valuing housing, etc., etc. So in taking part in this activity, housing associations said that they felt like there are practical changes that they can make, that it helped them thinking completely different using systems thinking, that it challenged or disrupted the way in which they do things, and that it helped to have ambition in thinking and really think and be prompted by peers to really state eventually that it helped them to think about how to systemically act about interrelated challenges. At the same time, they said that this provocation of the moratorium was really helping to challenge received wisdom. And it was actually the thing that they enjoyed the most in the workshop. One participant even said that actually before the workshop, there was thought that growth and quick growth and higher growth would always be good. But actually, if you take a step back, maybe growth that fast is not always good, or it can be detrimental to other things. So to conclude, I would just like to mention one thing, that this was one view from housing associations. But we do know that the problem in the social housing sector, in the housing sector, is like a big elephant. And we're trying to understand it by looking at bits and pieces of that without ever really understanding what it is. And that's why we've interviewed a range of actors across the social housing system, developers, architects, policymakers, residents, consultants, a very broad range of people to collect their view and understand their mental models. And by understanding these different mental models, we were able to understand, for instance, tensions between retrofit versus demolition. Why is it not happening already? For instance, the voice of a housing association saying it's not an easy right or wrong about refit or replace. Actually, we need to take into account the whole life of the building, and if you can't densify, then where's the money coming from? A developer saying, yeah, maybe it's better to knock it down and start again from an environmental perspective, but on the basis that the new build is to the higher quality, and this is compromised. An architect that says, well, if we only retrofit, there is a social justice issue because we need more homes. And another architect saying, well, actually, it seems to the benefit of the local authority to demolish homes in order to meet housing targets because it allows for more densification. A resident saying, we feel like we must build housing, and actually, we feel like we're in the way of progress because we're made to feel that way, that our homes have to be demolished. And an academic saying, well, CLTs and cooperative might choose to demolish and rebuild as much as the market would do, but it's a matter of maximization of choice. So eventually what counts the most is that people are able to decide. A very, very different picture. When we navigate the housing sector, we need to take into account that these are the very different mental models that we're going to encounter. And so to conclude, some key takeaways. Our causal loop diagram have shown that actually halting construction and demolition across the system could improve housing quality, tenants' health and well-being, and the management and finances of housing association. But in the workshop with housing associations, we also saw that we need to engage with alternative financial model of housing provision, with the quantity, quality, and adequacy of the housing stock, and with potentially new architecture and planning tools. We can also see that thinking in systems can help us understand interdependencies and far-reaching consequences. For instance, when we talk about doing something in a system, it might have benefits that are difficult to calculate right now within our system boundaries. And actually that those system interrelationships can be a form of evidence beyond data, beyond saying 20%, 40%, 80% gain. Those interrelationships are also very important to make us explain what needs to happen in the housing sector and to identify where we can intervene in the system. And finally, they're trying to understand what stays at the boundaries of those systems, and in the mental models of all those different stakeholders that we've seen, help us going towards the roots of the problem in the social housing sector today. So thank you for listening, and I open the floor to discussion.
Thank you so much, Anna. So I was just picking up on bits and pieces in the chat. So I guess one thing that we do need to address is some of our audience are operating in Wales or Northern Ireland and possibly Scotland as well. And obviously your research is relating to England. Is that because your research has been focusing on England?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. My research has been focusing on England. Of course, it's very different conditions. Also in the paper, we also explain why we've been focusing predominantly on that and the social housing shortage. However, it would be super interesting to do this at the UK scale. Well, there are different policies, of course, happening. I mean, Scotland, for instance, already abolished the right to buy. So the conditions are different, but it would be super interesting to explore this in different settings.
Yeah, if anyone's got any insights, then please do put your digital hand up or just speak out, and it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about that.
Yes, absolutely. It would be absolutely interesting. Of course, we cannot imagine a moratorium just happening in a little area. It's just that in this case, we were looking specifically at the policies of England.
Absolutely. Okay. And then some people have come back with some really good examples of reuse of buildings, really successful repurposing and reuse of buildings. So there's passive use hostel in Cirencester, the Barrel Store, Candelisa in Skipton, using old mills for housing. Funda's saying, Victorian House of the Future.uk is my retrofit project for those on low incomes. That sounds very interesting. Yep. Maybe you'd like to tell us a bit more about that, Funda, if you would like to.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anna. That was really fantastic, and lots of food for thought in there. Lots of things that I've kind of gone round about in my career and come back to and thinking, yes, the most sustainable way to build is to not build. But yeah, my project, the Victorian House of the Future, started because I found myself redundant and reliant on getting the Green Homes Grant to try and make my home more affordable to heat, to come out of fuel poverty. And as an architect, it was quite an interesting experiment to be in that situation. I found that there were sort of varying degrees of success to that. The most difficult thing was that obviously the retrofit was happening while I was living in the house and while I was trying to work as a self-employed person in that house on a low income. So it was massively disruptive. I found that lots of the tradespeople didn't really know what they were doing. So there were some fundamental mistakes made. I'll just give you one example. There are lots. The insulation in my roof, in my loft space, was laid over the floor, not under it. And then I was invited to put all my belongings back on top of that. Now, I don't think you have to be an architect to know that that isn't the way you deal with loft insulation. But if I felt like, is this actually a racket that's going on? Because my house is then ticked as having been retrofitted. So then I've gone on, I now work at Bath Spa University, and I have my research there is moving on with the Victorian House of the Future, where I've taken all the stuff that happens with the Green Homes Grant, insulation, ventilation, and solar panels I was afforded, which I was very lucky to get. And then going and looking at, well, if you are a person on a low income or a household, so that would be classified by the government as people with £30,000 or less household income. What can you reasonably do to an ordinary 2-up, 2-down Victorian house? So I went through planning and got planning permission for my house. I used A4 drawings of the house, traced over survey drawings with just a pen with a wobbly line, but to scale so that it could be repeated, and I called it a decarbonisation project. My planner invited me to change the word decarbonisation to loft conversion, which I didn't do and argued. So there was still a barrier, even though I had worked in that particular planning department for 15 years, and there was still a barrier to just using the word decarbonisation and using the word retrofit. And actually interpreting those policies. And this was Bath and North East Somerset Council. So the project is an experiment, basically, by somebody who is a retrofit expert. I'm a retrofit coordinator who has had to go through this process on a low income and also had to live in the house. And so it's the record of that story.
Thank you for sharing this.
That's great. Thank you. I think Tim's got his hand up. Tim, would you like to go forward?
Yes, thank you for that presentation, Anna. I mean, I suppose my perspective is from many decades of working in local planning. You didn't mention the sort of the focus of the sort of 5-year housing land supply in planning, which I mean, I'm not exactly sure when it came in, but in all my time planning, it was such a driver, if you like, that there was huge amounts of arguments, time spent, you know, planning inquiries, an adversarial system arguing about whether each local authority was providing 5 years of housing land, and the pretense really that if they did, that they would then automatically we would see house prices come down because we'd be addressing the supply and demand situation. And I absolutely agree with you that I think we're incredibly conditioned around supply and demand. But I think we need a different, I mean, we need to somehow get local authorities back to what they were originally created for, which was around provision of housing, but maybe in a different sort of way, with lots of different actors involved, so that their focus can simply be on making sure there's access to housing for those that really need it. And obviously that might involve new build, but a lot of it could be repair. So we need to, I mean, I'm a bit of a planning heretic probably, because I don't think a lot of my professional colleagues would necessarily agree with this, but you know, it's become so much part of the kind of conversation. You're not taken seriously if you talk like this, but I think we should actually scrap the 5-year housing land requirement, and actually just have there should be a program for, you know, within 2 or 3 years or whatever, that everyone should have access to a decent home. Those that are on housing waiting lists in affordable housing need, that should be the focus for local authorities. And I think planners and I think a lot of people would be attracted to work in local planning authorities if they could actually deliver on these needs, rather than just argue about housing numbers and whether enough land's being released for, you know, these big volume house builders, which, you know, in spite of all the arguments, you never see house prices come down. So I do think the lack of choice is part of I've always had a hunch that the lack of choice for people was driving up housing prices. If the only way of having a decent home is to mortgage to the hilt, then that would drive up house prices as well. Whereas if people have the option of decent rented accommodation, they might never actually worry about being house owners either. So I think we just have to completely rethink and get back to what local authorities were about, which was housing. So I do see planning as the answer, but you know, it's a very different kind of planning priority to the one that's set by our political masters.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing this. It's I mean, we could discuss for for a long time about this, and of course, I mean, also for those who are a little bit unfamiliar with that, the local authorities who used to be the main providers of social housing, called council homes, actually lost such a power, let's say beginning of the 1980s and end of the 70s. They used to have a lot of in-house expertise and even architects that were really taking care of building the best social homes, but then they couldn't build anymore, so they started actually selling their stock to housing associations, which were the partners that I work with. And actually, yes, so this expertise is lacking, and a lot of it nowadays they rely a lot on consultants, and often in the interviews that I've made, consultants play actually a big role in the decision to demolish, in the sense that when
paid advice eventually leads to the decision to demolish, hiring architects is already hiring them on the basis that a certain development will be demolished. Because so there is all sorts of, in the course of time, we can see all sorts of power. So different power dynamics that are at stake when it comes to you delivering social homes. And I fully agree. There is both the role of the public and the role of communities that needs to be strengthened in this picture.
Yeah. So I suppose if I ask the question, it's really, should the message be not so much just to stop house building, but actually have a different, have a positive objective of providing housing for those that need it, which lots of people say, but I think they always immediately think of massive council house building, which, it may be much more around sort of repair, retrofit, working with other agencies and co-housing groups, cooperatives, so all kinds of people. A more proactive sort of local authority kind of sector, which is a long way from where we are at the moment. But
I think that what you're saying is the answer indeed to what if we were, in order to provide more social homes for everyone, if we were to stop building, then we would definitely need a much more proactive. So the kind of question is formulated in a way for which it forces that kind of answer, because otherwise the answer will be immediately, well, we build 1.5 million homes so that we're going to provide affordable housing and social housing for everyone. Without solving the real issue, which is the kind of speculative mechanism that is at stake in densifying homes that eventually go to overseas investors. But definitely, we could frame it in very different ways. We chose to frame it in such a way because it really forces that kind of answer. It forces the need for this without any escape.
Anyway, thank you, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on this.
Great. Sadly, we're running out of time, but we'll pick up a couple of other bits in the chat. So I think this is probably from Matt. Hi, Matt. Bristol City Council exploring using existing buildings to provide specialist supported housing using a housing benefit finance model. That sounds interesting. Would you like to say a bit more about that, Matt?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I didn't know whether it was me, Matt, but yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, we're working with Bristol City Council at the moment where they've got obviously redundant buildings or buildings that have been unused and are occupied for some time. And I'm sure everybody knows in terms of the sort of absence of general needs housing, there's a massive issue with specialist needs housing as well, and huge issues with people traveling hundreds of miles to sort of accommodate members of a family. It's really distressing, to be honest. And one of the things that I understand, there might be others in the audience that might understand this clearer than I do, but we're only recently getting under the sort of the way in which the Bristol City Council are looking to finance this, which is by rather than having social housing grant from Homes England or wherever it might come from, and the cross-subsidy model, it's being subsidised through housing benefit, which in this instance doesn't have a cap because it's about the needs of the individual, if you sort of mean. So where there might be a little bit of an increased need to spend more on the capital development to retrofit, then there's an opportunity through that finance model to possibly do that because it's in the right location for the individual, which needs to be sort of connected to services and other aspects of that person's life. So I think it's an interesting area, and I think apparently Swindon Council have been doing some work in that area, and I think the contact at Bristol City Council is using that knowledge and trying to take that forward. But I feel like there's a bit of a template there that could be used across the country a little bit, which we'd be quite interested in trying to. I don't know. I was wondering about whether there was an opportunity to get some grant money from somewhere to try and develop that financial template model so that could go to different regions so that families could work with local authorities and work with local registered providers to help deliver it.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. If you have links or anything, feel free to share it in the chat, because it's
yeah, okay.
It's indeed and this would also require when we were talking about the systems benefits and going beyond silos, actually, whenever we talk about benefits, it's often perceived as a kind of a loss from a kind of a government perspective in terms of budget. But if we look at it from a systems perspective, the gains that you have in terms of health and well-being of residents do feed back in the system. It's just that we do have boundaries that are very narrow around what we consider as gain, let's say, within sectors. So I think that also that kind of reflection is important. For instance, what if we were including health benefits and health cost in viability assessments for developments? Then we would have very different developments.
Yeah. That life cycle assessment becomes much broader, doesn't it?
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for sharing.
I just wanted to pick up on a comment from Colin in the chat as well. Housing, especially new in non-sustainable locations, means more cars, more energy use, and a loss of community. Before we rush to convert employment buildings to residential, we need to look at how this affects the sustainability of an area or settlement. It's not always the answer. Conversion of isolated buildings in the countryside comes with a high energy demand for travel and more congestion. Time for us to think holistically.
Yes. And actually, I think that this is an interesting point. I have a colleague of mine who's done an interesting study on seeing how to combine basically the stopping building with the de-sprawling. And it was a way of trying to understand, we do have existing structures, how do you actually reuse existing part of buildings to densify in not cities. We're not necessarily talking about densifying everything around big cities, Glasgow, London, etc., but just in existing centres where you have a school, where you have small services and small communities, but kind of bringing it back into that dimension. I'm happy to share that study if you're interested in having a look at it.
That sounds great. Thank you. I think Colin's actually got his hand up. Would you like to come in, Colin?
Yes, can I just add to that? I think we keep reading, Tim hinted on it, we keep reading about sustainable development, but we're missing sustainable living. We seem to be wedded to the idea that sustainability is what we're seeking to achieve, and all our planning, and particularly the 1,500 extra homes and similar, is encouraging us to be unsustainable. So that's the joining up thinking we need. If we started with an urban audit, what's good, what's bad, what can we keep, what's good for people's health, welfare and social life, let's start there instead of this nonsense of saying we all need new houses.
Yes, I fully agree with you. And maybe I can also add a keyword that I very shortly mentioned, but I work in a field that is called degrowth. And basically, it's really putting human well-being and health and planetary health at the center. It's very different from sustainable development that has this kind of growth ingrained objective, but it really means what it means to really put back health and well-being at the center. And as you've mentioned, audits or citizen assemblies, or really bringing people together and discussing what do we do with what we already have and what would be the best for actually the health and well-being of people and the planet, and starting from there instead of starting the other way around.
We need to finish very soon, but I just wanted to leave you with a solution which comes from Elvid. He works for Pobble Group. He's saying that he's developing an early stage carbon assessment tool in Wales, which will help to prioritise retention and reuse of buildings and also channel development to sustainable locations. Elvid, please feel free to join in if you'd like to.
Thank you.
Explain a bit more.
I won't take all of the credit for that because I'm part of a team. It's Wood Knowledge Wales who are doing it, which you may or may not have heard of. But yeah, it's very interesting because I work in development. I work for a large housing association, and we will look at 50, 60 different sites all across South Wales in one at any given time, and I'm responsible for trying to bring a different change of mindset to the early decisions that you take about, well, shall we build here? It's sometimes you end up developing a site because it's convenient or politically important to do that. It shouldn't be about that. There should be, what the carbon implications should be considered early on. Then decisions about how to develop new homes or whether to convert something and reuse it are sort of guided by a sort of carbon budget, a carbon approach, which will tend to reduce mistakes being made about knocking buildings down or building in the wrong place. You know, it's another layer. I know it's a fresh idea maybe to what's being discussed today, but it's another way of looking at it. I have been involved in doing, you know, converting flats over shops and converting empty homes, and they're very, very difficult to do. You end up dealing with all sorts of third parties who think it's a chance to make money. Compulsory purchase is a nightmare. You know, there are lots of good ideas being discussed, but we need to understand, if we're going to get there, what the barriers and what's so difficult about the current system and the way it's geared. Why this isn't already happening if it's a great idea. So, yeah, a very thought-provoking session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to leave it there just because we're out of time, sadly. But a huge thank you to Anna. It was a really great, interactive and inspiring and thought-provoking session, as many have said in the chat already. And thank you all to everyone who's joined us this evening and for your contributions. It's just been so interesting to hear your thoughts on this extremely difficult but, you know, interesting subject. Just leave you with one last thing. You'll have a feedback form in your inbox. If you could just fill that in and send that back to us, that'd be fantastic. It really helps us to, you know, produce further interesting and fantastic sessions. We are a membership organisation, so if you're not already a member of the Green Register, then please hop onto our website and consider joining as a member. You'll save fees on events and lots of other things as well. And thirdly, we've just released a new qualification called Retrofit Skills. So if you know any contractors or would like to do retrofit skills yourself, it's a hybrid session. It's a hybrid course which encompasses a lot of practical skills as well, which I think we're all agreed that we will help to meet part of this huge challenge we've got to retrofit buildings around the place. So thank you so much again to all of you for joining, and to Anna, our speaker, and wish you all a great evening.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.